How can I have all these reactions and no viewers? Hi, folks. This is Tuesday night, and Joe Firestone for Real Progressives at 8 p.m. My topic for tonight is the progressive give-up formula in the 2018 elections. It's a bad problem. The progressive give-up formula is certainly a bad problem. But before we get into the formula for the 2018 campaigns, what I'm going to do is to review the progressive give-up formula in Congress so you remember it. And if you're being introduced to it for the first time, so you understand it. So basically, progressives in Congress, various think tanks, and among economists want very much to have a seat at the table, to be part of the village, sometimes sardonically called Versailles in the blogosphere. So to do that, they decide to participate in the annual budget games, some call the Hunger Games, in Washington, D.C. by offering their own deficit reduction plans. Now, you'd think that only the centrist think tanks and the conservative think tanks would offer budget plans. But right from the beginning, when the think tanks began to offer budget plans of their own during the Obama administration, of course, the progressives didn't want to be left out, so they began to offer their own deficit reduction plans. And their plans are better for working people than plans offered by the Committee for a Responsible the federal budget, which is a closely associated group to Pete Peterson and his foundation, okay, and his network of think tanks and granting organizations and experts haunting Washington, D.C., and campaigning for austerity continuously. Anyway, of course, there are plans that are offered by them and by Paul Ryan. Okay, and the progressive plans are a tad better. For one thing, they prioritize jobs and lower unemployment ahead of short-term spending cuts. For another, they raise income tax on Social Security contributions in order to strengthen the projections about Social Security solvency. They, of course, think that they're raising the income caps on Social Security so they can get taxes to pay for Social Security spending. But we know better. We know that Social Security payments don't really pay for Social Security spending. So we know that really it's in order to strengthen the projections from CBO, because CBO operates on the presumption that if the taxes are higher, there'll be more money in the trust fund, the fictional trust fund, which doesn't exist in a bank anywhere, but only in accounting books at the Treasury Department. Okay, and the progressive budgets are also better than the rightist ones because they normally address increasing healthcare costs much more seriously than either the rightist plans do or the centrist plans. These other plans just make assumptions about cost cutting if they do certain things to health insurance without beginning to indicate how these cuts would be achieved. Still, the bottom line of the progressive budget plans is that they've chosen to play the game of the neoliberals and to offer plans for reducing the deficit. Quote, by funding spending with the taxes, unquote, rather than saying directly, as Jamie Galbraith did in 2009, that there is no deficit, but national debt or debt to GDP ratio problem, that it doesn't exist. And so in place of reducing the deficit, what progressives ought to offer is a fiscal plan for returning to full employment and rebuilding America for the 21st century. But what happened instead? Well, the progressives in the period 2009 up until the present, really, and maybe I should say the progressives in quotes, they call themselves progressives, but there are some questions about that. Anyway, the agreement in Congress and in the D.C., New York village was to look at government fiscal policy through the lens of deficits, national debt, and the debt to GDP ratio, and also the pay-go principle in Congress, which was specifically to apply to bills other than those that Congress designated as exceptions. And the pay-go principle basically says that when you pass a spending appropriation, you need to specify the taxes that will be used to pay for it. So basically, you pay first and you spend later. Hence, it was known as pay-go. Now, there's a form, of pay-go, which existed actually going back, I suppose, to, until 1970s, at least as a concept. But it wasn't really implemented, okay, until the 90s at first. And it wasn't just a Republican plan to stop spending or trim spending, but also the Democrats were on board with it. And a very enthusiastic supporter of it almost from the start was Nancy Pelosi, who, as you all know, is now the minority leader of the Democrats. And if the Democrats took back the House in 2018 and 2019, she would once again be the Speaker of the House, God forbid. So, and probably supporting PAYGO every bit as strongly as she ever did. Anyway, this was the frame that was accepted for budgeting in the Congress by the progressives as well as by the rightists and the centrists. It's accepted by everybody in Congress, except when they felt they had to pass a bill that they really needed. Then, of course, they completely ignored the PAYGO principle, as in military spending, let's say, or some other things that were really, really urgent. Okay. So, of course, we have to note that to uncritically accept the problem framing of the opposition, specifically the PAYGO approach, is to give up the fight. Now, it's not necessarily to accept full defeat, but it is to ensure at least a partial defeat and a full defeat over time. And we have seen this happening as progressive programs are peeled back since the 90s, as the progressives retreat little by little, continuously compromising to get any deal at all out of the Republicans, and as the Republicans get closer and closer to repealing the entirety of the New Deal. Well, that's what happens when you accept the framing and the basic assumptions of the other side. And that is basically the progressive give-up formula right there. Accept the assumptions of the other side for framing a problem, and then you negotiate within that particular frame, which means you lose the battle before you start. That is providing you intended to win the battle in the first place. And there's considerable question about that. So to accept this neoliberal framing of the problem is to accept for the indefinite future the idea that every progressive government spending initiative must be evaluated in terms of whether or not we can afford it, or whether it destabilizes the debt to GDP ratio, regardless of the benefit it will deliver to Americans, or whether it accomplishes the public purpose. So, of course, this is the kind of defeatist frame, the kind of give-up formula that has to be rejected if we're going to have a truly progressive by Congress, and if we're going to turn the ship of American politics around so that it once again begins to serve the people and the public purpose. Government fiscal policy and the ideas of fiscal sustainability and responsibility, that is fiscal responsibility, need to be viewed from the broad viewpoint of the employment of government spending to fulfill America's public purposes, and not from a narrow one of how government fiscal activity will impact our deficits, the national debt, and the debt to GDP ratio. The reason for this is that for a nation like the United States, and you've heard this by now 100 times, but I'm going to repeat it again because it's so important, that for a nation like the United States with the fiat non-convertible currency, a floating exchange rate, and no debt that is denominated in a foreign currency, there is no risk of insolvency. However high the deficit, the national debt, or the debt to GDP ratio, insolvency cannot happen. Why can it not happen? Because the only currency that can get issued is the U.S. currency, whose issuance is controlled by the U.S. government, okay, and the U.S. government does not have to make any payments to anybody in any currency other than our own. So, whatever the levels of these statistics are, the constitutional authority of the government to spend on public purposes remains unimpaired, undiminished. So these numbers are not about the real economy. They're only statistics about the government's nominal economic activity. Now, statistics like this may be relevant for a government that is not sovereign in its own currency. They're very relevant for Greece. They're very relevant for Italy. They're very relevant for France. They're very relevant to all of the members of the Eurozone because they gave their currency up to the Troika, to the European Commission, the IMF, and the European Central Bank. These organizations, really the European Central Bank, controls the currency. So for them, since the currency is issued by an external entity, and since it stays scarce, it is like they're living on a gold standard. But we went fully off the gold standard in 1971. We don't have those limits. A lot of nations don't have those limits. The UK doesn't have those limits. New Zealand doesn't have those limits. Australia doesn't have those limits. Japan doesn't have those limits. There are many nations that are sovereign in their own currencies. So, in fact, if unemployment or lack of economic transformation or poverty or failing educational and healthcare systems continue to exist, then a successful effort to maintain a particular debt to GDP ratio or success in producing a fiscal surplus, that is a government budget surplus, are marks of fiscal irresponsibility, not fiscal responsibility. And the reason why they are that is because if you aim for reaching those statistical goals, you generally do not fulfill public purpose. Because you're not working for public purpose. You're working to maintain some arbitrary statistical goals. Well, I guess they weren't really entirely arbitrary. They came out of gold standard days. Basically, they were about doing something to maintain a quasi-gold standard when the gold standard had left. So, in aiming towards stabilization of debt to GDP ratios, the progressive budget plans offered, for example, by the Congressional Progressive Caucus, fall into the fiscal responsibility category just as the conservative plans do. They both fall into the fiscal irresponsibility category. The main difference is that when projecting out over a 10-year period, the progressive plans at first don't start with extreme austerity, but then they build it in on the back end of the 10 years. On the theory, the old theory, under the gold standard, that the federal budget has to be balanced over the long run, but not necessarily year by year. However, there is no deficit reduction problem in the United States. And the only fiscal sustainability and fiscal responsibility problems we have are the ones made by inventing a non-economic problem. That's a problem having nothing to do with economic outcomes, but only having something to do with strange standards that have emerged out of the political process, and diverting attention from real economic and social problems that we as Americans and as a society have. So now, this is the atmosphere of austerity and the progressive give-up formula that exists in Washington until this day. Now, it's been a little relaxed, actually, recently, because the Republicans went ahead and started blowing the budget. So the Democrats, some of the Democrats are saying, well, if the Republicans blew the budget, then really it's not a serious thing to reduce the deficits. So now let's have some spending for the people. As long as the Republicans spent for their cronies, we're more free to spend for the people now. So what they're saying is when we get back control of the Congress, we will spend for the people. Well, this really sounds good. The only problem is it doesn't address the underlying problem. It's almost as if they're saying, as long as they continue to believe in the principles of a long-run balance of the budget, as long as they believe in the idea that there's something virtuous in a balanced budget or something virtuous in reducing spending, okay, what they're really saying is, for a while, we're going to be just like the Republicans for our constituencies. That is, we're going to be fiscally irresponsible just like the Republicans for a while. And the implication is that they're also thinking until it catches up with us. And then we're just going to have to go back, to a budget balance kind of thing. That's what some of the Democrats are saying. But the good old pay-go Democrats, some of whom, such as Nancy Pelosi, claim to be progressives, okay, what they're saying instead is no, we can't be irresponsible like the Republicans. We have to be grown-ups. We have to be adults. We have to follow this wonderful pay-go system that has delivered such fine results for the American people. Now, she won't any longer say for our party, because she can't really claim any great results for our party, having lost, well, what's the total now? 1,100 seats in state legislatures across the country. And having lost extremely sizable majorities they had in 2009 in both houses of Congress, and had a situation which is now completely reversed, and lost the presidency in the Supreme Court too in the process. So she can't claim it's delivered fine results for the party. All I guess she can point to, but she can't really say, is that it's resulted fine. It's actually resulted in fine results for me. I mean, I'm worth $100 million now. Okay, anyway, let's not drag that sort of thing into the discussion, as of course I just did, having a little fun, but I couldn't resist. Okay, anyway, so there are a powerful group, okay, of Democrats that even now are saying we have to reduce the deficit. When we get back control of Congress, we've got to clean up the mess the Republicans have made. Part of the mess being that they blew the budget. And we're going to have to raise taxes, and we're going to have to be very frugal in our spending to clean up the mess. Just as Bill Clinton in the 90s cleaned up the mess, okay, which the Republicans had made, just as Barack Obama, after the first stimulus bill was passed, ever after tried to clean up the mess which the Republicans had made for the rest of his failed presidency, in my opinion. I think it was a grossly failed presidency, but that's a subject to be taken up again some other day, okay, and not now. So this is the atmosphere in Washington. There are probably still a majority who would be in favor of faux fiscal responsibility, FAUX, faux fiscal responsibility. That is the pay-as-you-go Democrats and the Paul Ryan Republicans joined, but once again by the right-wing Republicans, because they want to shout fiscal responsibility to the heavens when it comes to spending on people, to producing benefits for people, or doing what is good for the economy at large, other than what is doing good for their donors. So those groups will all join together, and probably the Democrats will have a tough time if they gain control again, doing deficit spending. If we don't get most of the Democrats who are there now out of Congress and into other jobs and replace them with people who are progressives. That's got to be done. Okay, but how about the crop of candidates who are running for Congress now, and there are many of them who seem to be very progressive and very good-hearted and very determined to do good things for people. How about them? What's going to happen to them? Will they partake of the give-up formula? Are they preparing the way in this campaign? Well, as many of you know, since December, I've interviewed 9 progressive candidates, one candidate who identified as a non-progressive, just a Democrat, and one candidate who identified as a progressive and was running for the Senate. And this list includes Justin Santopietro, Tim Canova, Richard Dean Winfield, Aaron Godfrey, Richard Hart, Seema Hernandez, Lisa Ring, Steve Schiffman. He was the only non-progressive, by the way. Also Michael Weiss, Steve Jaffe, and Peter Jacob. The first two can answer the key question, how are you going to pay for it, without saying they will raise taxes for revenue, that is to pay for things, for their programs, or that they will work to reduce the deficits to pay for things. Both know MMT. I guess that Justin probably knows it a lot better than Tim. But I think that Tim knows very well. I think that he basically believes in the fundamentals. And he knows enough to get the right advisors in to fill in details for him when he wants to do something in Congress where knowledge, of MMT would be very important. So there are those two. So it seems to me they can run campaigns that are not always talking about the pay-fors, and also when they get challenged about the pay-fors or the how you're going to pay for it, they can give credible answers. The others, Aaron Godfrey, Richard Hart, Seema Hernandez, who, by the way, is already out of her campaign. She was beaten in Texas by Beto O'Rourke. She made a very good showing in the race. She campaigned for a statewide office, spending only $4,000. And she still got but 23% of the vote. So she did extremely well, but nevertheless she lost, and she is out, at this point. But even if she were in, the only way she could answer the how you're going to pay for it question was, well, I'm going to raise taxes to pay for it. And I have the following taxes in mind. And she could do that very well, and she could argue for it very well, too. She was very articulate, very impressive as a candidate, and also strong motivation, too, apparently. But she didn't know how to avoid a tax trap. She didn't know how to avoid also the national debt trap. Also, Lisa Ring also had in mind taxes to pay for things. Other than taxes and issuing debt instruments, she had never heard, of any other way to pay for things, nor had she heard that actually taxes and bonds do not finance federal spending. She didn't know about any of that before we had an interview. And I don't know whether she's internalized it as yet. Steve Schiffman, of course, even if he did internalize about what I had to say, and I had no reason to believe that he did, because of how he defines himself and positions himself in a political way, he'd probably not use that knowledge in any case. Then there are Michael Weiss and Steve Jaffe and also Peter Jacob. They seem to be very interested in what they heard in the interviews that we had. But I have no idea whether they internalized it or have come around or are now capable of answering the how you're going to pay for it question in a credible way, which allows them to get through a campaign in the competitive races that they have. Steve Jaffe, in particular, is facing Ms. Pago herself, that is Nancy Pelosi. And it seems to me it would be very valuable to him to run against her, in part on the pay-go issue, because the pay-go system, coupled with the CBO projections, have both been a very big factor in containing progressive economic programs and keeping them off the table. The coupling of those two things was a big factor in blocking Medicare for All, in early years, and helping the president to take it off the table very early in about 2009, very soon after he came into the White House. It was also instrumental in defeating a very, very substantial public option bill of the kind that was advocated in 2008 by Jacob Hacker, so that the public option bill that finally came out of Congress was about 1/12 of the strength that Jacob Hacker's originally pay-go bill was supposed to be. And of course, that got quickly swept away by the conservatives, and right-wingers anyway, because they were afraid of a public option bill that was even 1/10 as large as it was supposed to be initially, and would certainly have failed. But anyway, that's another story. So I think it would be great for Steve Jaffe to be able to run against her by arguing that the pay-go idea had been damaging to people over a period of some 40 years, even before it was finalized in Congress. The pay-go philosophy was still there and was guiding spending as early as the Carter administration, and at various times even in the Reagan administration, and certainly during the Clinton administration also, when pay-go was in effect from 1990 to 2002. And when it went into effect again when Obama became the president. So Nancy Pelosi is very responsible for the effect that pay-go and CBO have had since the early 90s on the lack of really progressive legislation, fiscal legislation, actually getting through the Congress. And this is really her year to reckon with her performance. The question is, can Steve Jaffe make her actually reckon with it by pointing to an alternative way in which spending could have occurred, and to alternative policy proposals to get rid of pay-go and CBO projections, and to use real methods, of financing that reflect the actual monetary reality. That is to say, the monetary reality of spending is that it is ultimately financed by Congress through its appropriations, which mandate spending by the Treasury, and through its delegation of power to the Federal Reserve, which gives the Fed the power to mark up the Treasury spending account under certain conditions. That's the reality of what pays for spending. If we had a funding system in Congress that made that reality highly visible and highly transparent, the brakes would be off fiscal policy of a progressive character. So, in any case, the first two of my list can answer the question on how are you going to pay for it. The other 8, though, were all using the pay-for narrative to support their programs, including Michael Weiss, Steve Jaffe, and also Peter Jacob. In Richard Dean Winfield's case, it didn't seem to bother him that he had a very, very liberal spending program and that he was advocating for a platform with fiscal policy that was extremely progressive. Having the pay-for problem and the national debt problem didn't seem to bother him. He hearkened back to the days, of FBR, and he was taking the view that basically if FDR can do it, then we can do it now also. And if it involves tax and tax, spend and spend, and as Harry Hopkins said, tax and tax, spend and spend, and elect, then we can do that too. And that's what we should do. So he was very unabashed about that. But I don't know if he fully reckoned with the political climate of today, which involves an awful lot, of worry raised by years of propagandizing concerning the size of the national debt and its supposed impact on our children and our grandchildren. And of course, the coming interest burden, because everybody is, now predicting that interest rates at the Fed are going to go higher and higher, and pretty soon our interest burden is going to double. Oh, really, really frightening. We'll soon be spending $800 billion per year in interest on the national debt. Or maybe even more. Who knows? Could go up to $1 trillion a year. Then the deficit hawks are really going to be going crazy. The remaining 8 candidates, though, all seem to be holding back in advocating for expensive economic, social, or climate programs, such as a federal job guarantee or a Green New Deal or a substantial infrastructure program. Even when they verbally said they were for substantial efforts in these particular directions, they were not committing to specifics in these areas. So you couldn't tell what the qualitative words, large or substantial, or what they actually meant in terms of dollars the candidates were willing to spend. And hardly any of them were for or had thought about proposing a full employment guarantee, a job guarantee. And they were vague in committing to specifics in these areas. What do you suppose that is? Well, what I think, since none seemed anxious to talk about fiscal policy or how you're going to pay for it, I think they weren't trying to propose something like that because they didn't want to expose to people how they were going to pay for it. They didn't want to argue with people in the primary about how they were going to pay for it. Maybe they thought they could get through the primary without somebody raising the issue to them, their opponents in the primary, asking them how they were going to pay for their expensive programs. And so maybe they avoided advocating for a federal job guarantee because they thought, oh, that would be the most expensive, of all. And so I don't even want to think about how much that's going to cost or how I might explain how I'm going to pay for that. So, of course, the question is, what happens when their opposition on the primary trail calls them out on the how you're going to pay for it question? Do they really know how to answer it, or are they going to back off as they run the campaign and run towards the center in terms of their promises? Will they remain vague? Have some of them already given up on the boldness of their programs by trimming their agendas because they knew that explaining how they were going to pay for it was going to be difficult? Will they insist on paying for it all with taxes? That is, will they continue to insist on that but through their campaigns? In other words, will they continue to share the give-up formula frame that they need either taxes or borrowing to spend for things? Will they back off some of their platform during the campaign? Even more importantly, can we expect that they will be bolder when they get to Congress, or will they be even more conservative? What happens when they get to Congress and they're asked to join the progressive by caucus in Congress? You know, they go through orientation. They learn, if they don't already know, that there are these various caucuses, in Congress, and that the caucus most friendly to them would probably be the Progressive Caucus. They'll be told, when they get to the Progressive Caucus, they'll be told about pay-go. People have probably forgotten that at one time, the chairperson of the Progressive Caucus was Nancy Pelosi. At one time. She eventually resigned from the Progressive Caucus when she became the minority, when she became the leader of the minority in the House, which I believe was in 2002 or 2004. But when they get there, they're going to be told about the pay-go system. And they're going to be told about the annual caucus game of trying to develop a report that promises to deliver small deficits after a short period of not nearly expansive enough but federal spending. Oh, they're going to be told about that. All right. The first few days, that they're there. Are they going to give up the ghost to pay-go and to the austerity framing? Are they going to play the budget games? Or are they going to form a sub-block or sub-caucus? Are they going to try to reform the pay-go system? Are they going to try to throw the budget games out and try to reform the CBO as best they can and get the CBO not to make any projections any longer? We know the CBO projections are nonsense. But I've been saying that since 2010, when I did some rough spreadsheet calculations on how easy their projections could fail, and when I reflected back on the history of the CBO and how often they were wrong. But a fairly good quantitative analysis even a very good quantitative analysis, the best I've seen anyway for some time, was recently done by Justin Santopietro himself. And he showed in certain instances that the CBO had committed trillions of dollars, in errors. In other words, they were off by trillions of dollars in their projections over a very short period of time. And of course, it's common knowledge in Congress that what happens at the CBO is they do a projection in very early in the year, in January or February, concerning what the fiscal year, which, by the way, started back on October 1st, but they're projecting out in January for the rest of the year what things are going to be like. Usually they're back in May and June to revise their projections because they haven't even been accurate for that short period of time, with half the year of actual results in back of them. With a quarter of a year of actual results came back of them, they still can't project accurately for the rest of the year. And then there are the May and June projections, of CBO, which in turn are not accurate for the remaining 3 months. They certainly were not accurate if you look at their projections from the spring of 2008 until the end of 2008. They were off by huge amounts, of dollars. So anyway, Justin has tracked all that, in a paper that he gave at the MMT conference, which was, a very good paper. So he's quite aware and advocated in the paper for changing the function of CBO from essentially making projections to doing evaluations of past performance, of Congress. And I think that he's dead right about this. So, to avoid non-progressive answers to these questions, that I've raised, the candidates will have to be able to answer the how you're going to pay for it question in a sure-footed, convincing way, and will need to argue their case during their primary campaigns. And believe me, if they get through those primary campaigns, some of which end quite late in June, and of course the general election is in November, in the intervening short 4 months or so, they're going to have to argue even more convincingly, argue their case even more convincingly that they know how to pay for it. Because if their Democratic primary opponents haven't raised this question for some strange reason, you could be sure their Republican opponents in the fall are going to raise the issue of fiscal responsibility and fire it at them. And they won't care if the Democratic candidates, hopefully progressive at this point, turn around and fire the same charge back at the Republican. But they won't care because from the Republican point of view, the Republican in these districts will probably be an incumbent. And therefore, the odds will favor the incumbent. So the incumbent is more about essentially blackening the name of the progressive challenger than upholding his own positive image, his or her own positive image. So there we are. If he can attack the probability, if he or she can attack the probability of the challenger, I shouldn't say the probability, but the reliability of what the challenger has to say, and emphasize the improbability of what the challenger has to say, then the rhetorical victory goes to the incumbent and not to the progressive who's defensively answering, "That's the pot calling the kettle black." Yeah, that's a nice line. But the fact is, people didn't really believe the incumbent congressperson when they talked about fiscal responsibility in the first place. So it's important that they believe what the progressive challenger has to say. And that will depend on the progressive challenger arguing for how you're going to pay for it in a convincing and sure-footed way. Now, they could say the taxes don't fund federal spending, and they could also say that the size of the debt doesn't really matter. And they could also say they support repealing the debt limit to end all debt ceiling crises so that the government can run the large deficits needed to pay for their programs without a periodic crisis of any kind. And they could also support getting rid of the PAYGO system and also CBO projections with their emphasis on deficits neutrality. Yes, they could do that, and maybe they'd be successful. But I think the Republican challengers would wave the bloody shirt of the public debt at them. And again, even if they wave it back, there's still going to be debt terrorism and also debt mongering, on both sides, which is only going to increase the anxiety the public has about the existing national debt. So that can't be good for this particular approach to securing the Congress for progressive spending. However, the progressives in question can also say they will work to repeal PAYGO, to restrict the CBO to doing evaluations after the fact rather than to projections. And they could also advocate for implementing overt congressional financing and restrict the CBO to evaluations. So there we are again, the language for overt congressional financing. So what does this language do again? It makes transparent the idea that was expressed in the Constitution when it was formulated by the Founding Fathers, that it's Congress that does the spending, and Congress that actually delegates its authority to the Treasury to do its taxing. That's what the Constitution actually authorizes. So spending and taxing are actually congressional functions that are delegated to servants of the Congress. The executive branch is one servant of the Congress when it comes to implementing the laws. Since 1913, the Federal Reserve has been another servant of the Congress when it comes to issuing currency and reserves to the Treasury Department that the Treasury Department can use to spend. So these things, the taxing and the spending powers, come from the Congress. Today, the spending takes place through the Treasury. It spends into the economy. When the Treasury spending account has to be marked up for the Treasury to do further spending, that happens through the Federal Reserve actually marking up the Treasury account. That's what happens. Now, we have come to think that it's actually the taxes that pay for spending. But that's not true. What directly pays for spending is, again, the Federal Reserve marking up the Treasury spending account so the Treasury can spend, and the Congress appropriating the money. These two clauses, or two sentences, I should say, in a single clause, would make transparent what was in the Constitution, but still in the Constitution. And that is to say that it's by the authority of Congress that the Fed fills the Treasury spending account, both to spend the appropriations of Congress and to repay the national debt as it falls due. So all overt congressional financing would do is to make explicit and transparent that it is Congress that is the font of the federal spending. And that there's no need to tax or to issue debt for the revenue it provides for spending. That those functions of the Treasury Department that have been delegated to it by the Congress have a different purpose. And their purpose is to drain money out of the economy to make room for the federal spending. The function of both of those things is to control inflation. It is not to pay for things. And overt congressional financing would make that completely transparent and completely explicit. So, this is something that could easily be explained, okay, by any of the candidates. That it's Congress that has the constitutional authority to spend. That's where the spending authority actually originates. That's where the funding actually occurs through Congress and its delegated agent, the Federal Reserve Banks. Okay, the first of the two choices, which the progressives can choose, will be met with mainstream outcries. In other words, just continuing to issue debt and repealing a debt ceiling will be met with outcries from the mainstream about, quote, the debt owed by every American, our children and our grandchildren. That will drive us all broke, and with further outcries of fiscal irresponsibility and angry support for the existing pay-go system in Congress. The second alternative, the overt congressional financing alternative, will be met with the same outcries about pay-go, but it won't be met with outcries about the debt, because it obviously is going to pay off the debt gradually over time and in a noticeable way within 3 to 6 months. But it will be met with other outcries about inflation and hyperinflation. So which should our progressive candidates choose in order to avoid falling into the trap of the give up formula once again? I say it is the second, because in the absence of inflation and the presence of austerity, getting rid of austerity and delivering on the postponed needs of many years is a very compelling appeal. In addition, overt congressional financing will be ending the debt as we know it, going forward, as we know it, right? Going forward. So what I say is, you progressive candidates, take the plunge. Answer the how you're going to pay for it question. Get the Green New Deal and end the faux debt issue by ending the debt. That is what you ought to be doing in this campaign. That is what you ought to be doing when you get to Congress. Don't back off a single inch. Okay, folks, so we have a few minutes. I plan to quit this at 9:15 because Victor, Tiffany, and Kelly Lane have a live stream coming up at 9:30. I want to clear the decks for them. I can entertain a few questions. Please don't forget the Patreon accounts that we, at Real Progressives, have. And please don't forget also my own Patreon account. Any patrons will be very much appreciated. For now, let's get in some questions or comments before we have to quit. So Mark Fabian says, Susan, is that Susan Eldridge? Probably. Susan, FDR started FICA to give citizens a sense of skin in the game and to make it very difficult to have Social Security attacked by conservatives. But it didn't pay for anything, just numbers in a ledger. Also, I never even noticed the little that FICA took from my take-home pay until around 1975. That's when it became the largest deduction. Actually, it became even larger, in 1983, after the compromise which the pay-go Democrats made with the Reagan Republicans. And Rob Rivera asks me, how are you going to pay for it? Well, we're going to pay for it through our Patreon contributions. But Mark, yes, FDR started FICA to give citizens a sense of skin in the game and to make it very difficult to have Social Security attacked by conservatives. Well, that worked for a while, but how's it worked in recent years? It hasn't held them back at all, has it? They're trying to privatize Social Security for all they're worth. And they've been trying to do that since the year 2000. And they've been making some progress. They've been slowing down the cost of living increases. And Social Security payments have fallen far, far behind actual cost of living for the elderly, because the COLA use of Social Security is very inappropriate for the elderly. Doesn't cover the rises we've seen in medical expenses and also in rent, very frankly. So I think a much better justification for Social Security was given by FDR in 1944 when he made a part of the Second Bill of Rights, okay, the Economic Bill of Rights, and declared it a right, okay, of American citizens. That's what we need to campaign on now. We need to go around saying it's our right. And if somebody says, well, it's an entitlement, then we say, screw you, an entitlement is a right. It's something I'm entitled to. And when you try to interfere with my rights, I get real pissed off and real ugly. So get off it. Get off the entitlement BS and get off the privatization BS. This is our right, and we're taking it. If you don't willingly yield it, we're taking it. Now you shut up about Social Security. STFU. So Denise Kenahan says we need to print money for the right things that benefit the people. And guess what? The government has that power, and it's printing money for what it thinks we need. Bank bailouts, foreign wars, and essentially tax cuts for billionaires. The question is this the way you want the government to spend money? Well, that's pretty good, except we don't really print money these days. We create most of the money out of thin air by essentially marking up spreadsheets at banks, by marking up accounts. Okay, that's the way the money is actually created. But it is created at will by the Federal Reserve. He says, yeah, I know the tax cut for billionaires are not really spending. Well, they have the same effect on the governmental deficit that spending does. But let's put it this way, they're not really an effective benefit for the wealthy in terms of the macro economy. Okay, because they're worth about 30 cents into the economy for every tax dollar that is given but to the wealthy. Would doubling Social Security make a huge impact on the economy? You betcha, Rob. It would certainly make a huge impact on the economy. It might have to be done over 3 years to ensure the economy could absorb the shock without having an undue effect on inflation. But I think that's a matter for some reasonable computer simulations to decide. It might not be very inflationary at all. We'd have to see. It would certainly be stimulative, though, to the economy. Progressive said both parties teamed up to kill the full employment policies of the New Deal, ushering in a neoliberal era. Now we privatize the public space and deregulate everything. Yet people don't think it's government's job to invest in society. Exactly, and that is among the most stupid things that people think. However, I want to point out, before I go, because I do have to leave in just a minute, our progressive candidates, some of them, appear to think that it's better to call for private sector spending on certain things. It's better to bring private sector money home from overseas through perhaps even tax incentives than it is to have government actually do the investments that have to be done. Of course, since there's no shortage of money for fiat sovereign, what I say is don't make any compromises with the people who have their money overseas and will not invest it here. First of all, probably a lot of that money is not overseas unless they've converted it to other currencies. Okay, but if it's sitting in in U.S. currencies somewhere, then it's probably in the form of treasury debt at the Federal Reserve. So I don't buy the idea that there's so much in so much in the money of the United States sitting over in other nations' accounts somewhere. Okay. However, wherever it is sitting, if they don't want to invest it in our economy, that's fine. Let the government begin to do the investment and heat up our economy. And when that happens, it won't be very long until the people who've been sitting on their money want to be part of the party, and they bring that money home. And when they do, what we ought to do is to tax it at its full original rate so that there is no moral hazard involved when they bring that particular money home. Okay, folks. Okay, there is the Susan Beaver says, I know because taxes are deleted, but how do you convince people that no such thing exists? Well, we're trying to do that. We're repeating that a lot. We've convinced a lot of people, okay, of that. But they say it does seem to be hard to persuade people, okay, to believe that, even though it is our reality. That, in part, is why I've now come out with a proposal to do overt congressional financing. Because there's nothing so convincing when you want to make the claim that taxes do not fund spending as to put in a measure that makes it transparent that taxes do not fund spending. And that's what OCF would do. I see quite a lot of other late comments here. I'll try to answer them in the comment thread, but now I have to end. Okay, our broadcast. Okay, it's 9:18. Okay, and Victor Tiffany is going to be coming on. Okay, 9:30. So thank you very much for coming and for your participation. And I'll see you on Thursday. Steve Jaffe is coming back on Thursday. So that should be a very interesting discussion since he would have had a week to have thought on the various things I've said. But very much of the program, maybe most of it, will be occupied with him talking through the rest of the platform he has. He didn't get a chance to talk it through last week. He will get a chance to talk it through this Thursday. However, we come on this Thursday at 9 p.m. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye, folks.